Good evening and welcome to the February program from FLAIR, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. My name is Diana Carlin and I'm the FLAIR treasurer and also a member of the board of directors. So we want to welcome all of you for joining us, our members and members of the public, and we especially want to welcome and thank all of our institutional members and all of you who make our programming possible. Tonight we are partnering with one of our institutional members, the White House Historical Association. And this is our February program, which is recognizing Black History Month. And our topic is First Ladies in Slavery, and it will be presented by Sarah Fling, who will be introduced in a little bit. I just want to mention a couple things about FLAIR. First of all, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, our mission as FLAIR is to really promote research and education about First Ladies and provide that information in a way that public can enjoy it, like what you're doing now, and that those of us who are researchers, scholars, archivists, historians, biographers have a way of convening and sharing our information about what we're doing and assisting one another so that we can get these stories of these remarkable women out to everyone. So with that said, it's now a real pleasure for me to introduce the president of the White House Historical Association, Stuart McLaren. Stuart?
Hello, I'm Stuart McLaurin, President of the White House Historical Association. It's my privilege to share with this FLAIR gathering some of the very important work that we at the Association have been working on over the past 7 years regarding slavery in the President's neighborhood. You may remember it was in the spring of 2016 when First Lady Michelle Obama was giving a commencement speech, and later that summer at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia, where she said, "I wake up every morning in a house built by slaves." Well, as you would expect, our phone rang off the hook, our website was inundated, people wanted more information. They wanted to know the story behind the story. Well, we knew that there had been enslaved people involved with building the White House, but we took it as our obligation and responsibility to delve deeper into that story. And we looked at it from 3 vantage points. We have the honor of occupying historic Decatur House here on the northwest corner of Lafayette Park, across from the White House. It's owned by the National Trust for Historic Preservation, but we have a long-time partnership to steward this property as if it's our own. In this facility, in this beautiful home, is the extension added to accommodate occupants who were slaveholders. It is the last remaining example of how enslaved people lived in the President's neighborhood. So we have the opportunity of using this facility to share that story and to train through our education programs and through visitors who tour the facility to share with them this very difficult, awful part of American history. We also look to historic Lafayette Park, just out the window from where I sit now. This was where the workers all assembled, free workers, European craftsmen, and enslaved laborers who worked right here to build the President's house. We've done research into how they worked, where they lived, what they did, and to the degree we can determine where they came from. And just with the National Park Service, in just the last 2 years, we have erected wayside markers on the north side of the park that in visual narrative as well as audio tell the story of those workers. These workers gave their blood, sweat, and likely even their lives in some cases to build the White House. And they never dreamed that over 2 centuries later, as people crossed this park, that they would be reminded of the people who lived and worked in that place to build the White House. And then the third part of our research has focused on those who were enslaved workers in the White House itself. Our early presidents, 11 of them, either owned slaves or hired slaves to work for them in the White House. A very compelling and important part of White House history, and it's important to us to tell that story as well. Through our research, through the resources that are available on our website that have been created by the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History, our staff team here, you can now have access to this rich and robust treasury of information on slavery in the President's Neighborhood from those 3 vantage points. We will continue this research. It's a very important and compelling part of White House history, and it's something that we need to continue to learn more about. I hope you will explore the resources that we have available, and thank you for your interest and your support for this very difficult story, but important story. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the important subject of First Ladies and slavery. And thank you so much to Flair for having me. Now, if we could pull up the slides, we can get started. Wonderful. So today I would wager that most Americans don't associate the First Ladies with slave ownership. In fact, I think it might be surprising to some to learn that slavery was a significant aspect of the lives and the identities of nearly 1/3 of the women who have held that role since the nation's founding. Generally speaking, men often shoulder responsibility for slave ownership, and women are left out of the narrative. But in fact, slave-owning women's lives were very closely tied to enslaved labor. So women should be equally remembered for their role in the perpetuation of human bondage. The slide and the image that you can see on screen, I think, is a great way to begin because it depicts First Lady Martha Washington with the rest of the Washington family in a portrait by Edward Savage done in the 1790s. And directly behind Martha Washington, you can see a depiction of an enslaved man. This is very likely William Lee, who served for many years as the enslaved valet of President George Washington, but it draws a direct connection between Martha Washington's life and the use of enslaved labor, not only at Mount Vernon, but later at the presidential households in Philadelphia and New York City. And you have to forgive me, it's quite noisy downtown in Washington, D.C. today, so you may hear some sirens. Now, as the First Lady, Martha Washington set many precedents for the women who would be her successors in the role. And one of those precedents was how to be a First Lady that was simultaneously a slave owner. So let's go to the next slide. As part of our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative, historians here at the White House Historical Association have worked for the last 3 years to identify presidents who were either slave owners during their lifetime or who used enslaved labor at the White House. And you can see the list here. I'll give you just a moment to look at some of these names. Generally speaking, 9 presidents used enslaved labor at the White House and 12 were slave owners at some time in their life. But today we're not talking about them. We're talking about the First Ladies. So I want to shift our focus from these men to the list that you'll see on the next slide. So if we could go one more. Perfect. So you can see here, I'm sorry, let's go back one. You can see on this slide the list of First Ladies who were either born into slave-owning families or who married into them later in life. And in total, this makes up nearly 1/3 of America's First Ladies. You can see that those who were born into slave-owning families include Martha Washington, Martha Jefferson Randolph, Dolly Madison, Elizabeth Monroe, Louisa Catherine Adams, Emily Donaldson, Angelica Van Buren, Letitia Tyler, Sarah Polk, Margaret Taylor, Mary Lincoln, and Julia Grant. And then we have 4 more First Ladies who married into slave-owning families later in life: Sarah Jackson, Jane Harrison, Julia Tyler, and Eliza Johnson. You'll notice that I include here not only First Ladies, but White House hostesses, nieces, daughters, etc., who served in that role because I think that they have the same relationship with slavery as these other First Ladies. And I also want to note that legally, female slave ownership varies from state to state during this time, as well as between time periods. So in this presentation, you'll learn about First Ladies in slavery, but some of these individuals may not have legally belonged to the First Ladies. Still, these white women played an important role in the management of enslaved labor. And interestingly, there's actually rich evidence of First Ladies as slave owners. So when you look at the letters, diaries, memoirs of many of these women, they mention enslaved men, women, and children more than you might think. In fact, many of them made no attempt to hide their relationship to slavery and the way that they benefited from it. In fact, some of them even felt that it was something to be proud of. Next slide, please. So the vast majority of those women I just mentioned were born into slave-owning families, which means that slavery influenced their skill set and lifestyle from cradle and for some to grave. From a young age, these first ladies would have learned how to manage enslaved laborers. They would have learned how to discipline them and how to implement various forms of punishment when necessary. From a young age, they would have grown up either playing with enslaved children, being gifted enslaved companions as children, or even being raised by enslaved nurses. So we know, for example, that Mary Lincoln was raised by an enslaved woman who she called her Mammy Sally, and that she felt a very close tie to her later in life. And that Julia Dent Grant grew up playing with almost a dozen young enslaved children on her father's Missouri plantation. Then many of these first ladies perpetuated the cycle once more when they were in adulthood by giving their children and grandchildren to enslaved nurses to be reared. So you can see in the image on this screen here a photograph of a woman named Dolly Johnson, who was enslaved by Andrew and Eliza Johnson in Tennessee prior to their time in the White House. And Dolly is actually pictured here holding Andrew Johnson Stover, their grandson, as she helped to raise him and rear him. But slave-owning women who lived in households that had enslaved servants would be woken, dressed, and groomed by enslaved ladies' maids. They would be warmed by fires tended to by enslaved servants, and they would have been served food and drinks that were made by enslaved cooks or handled by enslaved butlers. So they're benefiting from enslaved labor all day, every day. As I mentioned, growing up in a slave-owning family would influence one's skill set and lifestyle. So from a young age, these women would have had the privilege of being served, which means they often avoided learning skills that were necessary in 19th century households, like cooking, cleaning, or doing other household chores. I think an ideal example of this is the quote that you can see on screen here from Julia Grant. She grew up on her father's plantation in Missouri called Whitehaven. And in her memoir, she talks a lot about her upbringing in Whitehaven, but also discusses the fact that later in life, she attempted to cook biscuits, but did not know how to. She writes, "They were not at all like home biscuits. I presume that the cook would have done better if I had ever prepared any before. I had only cut out small cakes with my thimble from the dough prepared by my black mammy." Of course, referring once again to an enslaved servant who was typically doing the cooking and preparations in their households. Let's go to the next slide to see another example of this. Dolly Madison was accustomed to a life of privilege after marrying into a slave-owning family, and she complained to her sister once that she thought her enslaved lady's maid Suki, who I'll discuss in more detail later, had been stealing from her. But rather than getting rid of her or selling Suki, Dolly wanted to keep her because she writes that it's terribly inconvenient to do without her. So I must even let her steal from me to keep labor from myself. So in the end, the skills expected of a proper 19th century wife, like cooking, cleaning, taking care of these tasks, raising children, could be avoided if you're supplanting enslaved labor for your own work. Next slide, please. Now, these connections that I mentioned all connect first ladies to slavery through family, but another more close tie comes when we see that many enslavers began one-sided relationships with enslaved women, leading to actual blood ties with enslaved communities. So for example, an enslaved man named James Hambleton Christian claimed that he was the half-brother of Letitia Christian Tyler, and he was later held in bondage at the Tyler White House as a servant by his own kin. Obviously, James did not appreciate being held in bondage, even if he had these family ties, so much so that we know that he self-emancipates, runs away via the Underground Railroad, attempting to go to Canada. And though we don't know much about his fate, it is inspiring to know that James sought his own freedom. Similarly, President Thomas Jefferson's daughters, including the occasional White House hostess Martha Jefferson Randolph, were the half-sisters of the children that were born between Jefferson and his enslaved servant, Sally Hemings. Despite being Jefferson's biological children, they were enslaved because slavery as a status passes on the mother's side. And these relationships are important to understand because even though they blur the lines between family and property, these enslaved people are never considered part of the family. White slave owners are assuming dominance over them, and they're not being freed or treated differently. The status of being enslaved also passes between family. A slave-owning woman's dowry, inheritance, and social status, which often included enslaved property, typically improved the suitors that she would be offered as an adult woman. For example, Angelica Van Buren, who served as White House hostess for Martin Van Buren, came from a wealthy slave-owning family, which enabled her to make a match with Van Buren's son, Abraham. Other first ladies in the 19th century made economically lucrative partners for men who were searching for that wealthy slave-owning family. Sarah Polk, Letitia Christian Tyler, and Margaret Taylor are all examples of this. And most importantly, the wealth that a plantation provided made it possible for these husbands to eventually pursue careers in politics that ended with the presidency. In particular, plantations provided a consistent form of income while one was absent in Washington, D.C., even living at the White House. Next slide, please. So, upon moving into the White House, we're jumping ahead to the actual First Ladyship here. A First Lady's duties, of course, rely upon a workforce. In the modern day, that is, of course, free workers, but in the 19th century, these women often chose to employ enslaved workers. In this period, supervision of the home is, of course, considered a woman's sphere, a woman's duty. And the maintenance of the White House in the 19th century was not only laborious and expensive, but presidents and first ladies were also expected to pay out of pocket for staff and for entertaining, which means that it was financially beneficial for many of these slave owners to, instead of paying for white laborers, to instead bring in slave laborers from their own home or plantation. So as a result, a great example of this is that to save money, Sarah Polk brought enslaved workers from her Polk Place plantation and chooses to fire the baker, the chef, and the steward who had worked at the White House for 2 decades, supplanting them for free labor. Now, Mrs. Polk also used other free and enslaved laborers from the DC area, even hiring out a man named Paul Jennings, who was enslaved by the Madisons, to work briefly at the White House. And entertainment, still to this day, is a critical part, of course, of a First Lady's role and a First Lady's duties. So at this time, enslaved people are making this possible. We see enslaved cooks, butlers, doormen, and ladies' maids being a part of these major White House events across several slave-owning administrations. In fact, enslaved labor was so ubiquitous in Washington, D.C., because of it being between the 2 slave states of Maryland and Virginia, that even first ladies who were morally opposed to slavery still witnessed and at times benefited from the institution. Abigail Adams was a witness to this. She denounced slavery many times through her life, but observed its use in the president's neighborhood. So this quote that you see on screen is from her correspondence in 1800, where she writes that the effects of slavery are visible everywhere in Washington, D.C., and that she had amused herself from day to day in looking at the labor of 12 enslaved people from her window who were removing some dirt outside of the house. Next slide, please. Now, while many first ladies participated in the institution of slavery in their childhood, many of them participated in it at the White House, but for many that continued after the White House for the rest of their lives and into the post-first ladyship. In many cases, American first ladies inherited the use of enslaved individuals after the death of their husbands, being permitted to utilize that labor until their own passing. And many of them did not use this opportunity to free any of these enslaved laborers. So, for example, Martha Washington legally owned one enslaved man outright named Elish, and rather than freeing him, as was in her purview, she chose to will him to her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, and his heirs, quote, forever. And this differentiates herself from George Washington, who had freed the individuals that he personally owned upon his death. And I think that this anecdote underscores a critical part of understanding the First Ladies and slave ownership, which is that they didn't always share the same opinions that their husbands might have had on the subject. So historians know that George Washington's stance on slavery as an institution evolved and shifted over his lifetime. But Martha Washington didn't really change her mind. She was a supporter of slavery. She benefited from it her entire life and then ensured the continuity of the institution of slavery in her will as one of her last acts. Similarly, one of Dolly Madison's final acts was to sell her husband's Montpelier estate, splitting up the enslaved community that lived there, severing relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, brothers and sisters, in order to settle her debts. So she's fragmenting so many families in this process. And one of the most heartbreaking examples of this is the story of Ellen, her lady's maid, is the story of Ellen, the youngest daughter of Mrs. Madison's lady's maid, Sukey. So let's go to the next slide and learn more about Sukey and Ellen. So Sukey had served as Dolly Madison's lady's maid for many, many years. She served her in Montpelier, she served her at the White House, and had also moved with Mrs. Madison back to Washington, D.C. after Mr. Madison's death. And the role of a lady's maid is really important for a first lady. This would have been a very intimate relationship. She would have helped her get dressed, done her hair, prepared baths, and done other really personal tasks as needed throughout the day, traveling with her anywhere she went. Sukey continued to live with Mrs. Madison in these post-James Madison years, and this is the time period where we see Dolly selling off the plantation and separating enslaved families. And that includes selling away several of Sukey's children. By 1848, Dolly had sold and separated Sukey from all but one of her children, her youngest daughter, Ellen. And that year, Ellen overhears plans that she too is going to be sold by Mrs. Madison, permanently separating her from her mother. But Ellen doesn't sit well with this. She decides that she's going to attempt to seek her own freedom, escaping from Washington, D.C. via the Potomac River, alongside 76 other enslaved individuals in a larger plan to attain freedom for all of these people. And they take a boat called the Pearl, a schooner, on the Potomac. But unfortunately, their plan is compromised, and the Pearl is captured. This is known by many historians today as the Pearl Incident. Many of those enslaved individuals who had attempted to seek their freedom on the Pearl were sold to the South as punishment for their attempt. But Ellen is luckily purchased by abolitionists and given her freedom, and she lives as a free woman after this fact, although we don't know much about Ellen's life. However, Dolly wants to punish somebody for what she thinks is a breach of trust and also for the financial cost of losing Ellen's labor. So she decides that instead of being able to punish Ellen, as Ellen is no longer present, she punishes Sukey, selling Sukey to the South as punishment for her daughter's behavior, permanently separating mother and daughter. Dolly's actions in this moment are actually cruelly defying James Madison's will, which you can see on screen, where he says that he gives and bequeaths his ownership of the people of color held by me to my wife, but it is my desire that none of them should be sold without his or her consent, or in the case of their misbehavior. And clearly that's what Mrs. Madison is doing in the case of Sukey. So just an example of the fact that these first ladies are participants in slavery, sometimes in the cruelest sense of the word. Next slide, please. But I do want to mention before I wrap up today that, of course, not all first ladies were pro-slavery. As I mentioned, Abigail Adams was very much anti-slavery, supporting abolition long before it became a real possibility in the United States. And Mary Lincoln, despite being born into a slave-owning family and reared by an enslaved nurse, came to oppose slavery alongside her husband, even forming a tight-knit relationship with the woman you can see on screen named Elizabeth Keckley, who was born into slavery, became a free woman, and then later worked as Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker and confidant. Other first ladies worked toward racial equity in the years that followed, including Lucy Hayes, who opposed slavery prior to the Civil War and then promoted racial equality in the Reconstruction era. Next slide. So this is the slide that I want to end with, because although these stories of the first ladies are important and interesting, these people who actually experienced the cruelty of slavery at the hands of the first ladies are at the heart of this story and at the heart of the Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative. So you already heard about Dolly Johnson, who is owned by Andrew and Eliza Johnson. She's on the left-hand side. Next is Paul Jennings, who I mentioned was owned by James and Dolly Madison and rented out for a time at the Polk White House. He was president during the burning of the White House in 1814 and famously wrote the first staff memoir ever published about the White House and was present when the portrait of George Washington was famously saved. Next, we have Elias Polk, a man who was owned by Sarah and James Polk and actually was gifted to the Polks as a wedding gift from Sarah Polk's father. So a great example of that relationship of enslaved people being given as part of a family dowry. And then finally, we have Winnie Monroe, whose story is a little bit different. She was enslaved by distant family members of Lucy Hayes. Eventually, Lucy's father freed the Monroes as he was staunchly anti-slavery, and Winnie maintained a really close relationship with Lucy Hayes and Rutherford Hayes for the rest of her life, even working as a paid servant in the White House. So you can see this image of her working as a nurse for the Hayes children. So in the end, some first ladies like Dolly Madison, Sarah Polk, or Julia Grant were very closely involved in managing enslaved households, and others like Abigail Adams were not participants in the institution, but witnesses. Nevertheless, all American first ladies have been touched by slavery in some way, if only for the reason that, as Michelle Obama noted, they all wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope that you learned a lot about the relationship between first ladies and slavery. But if you're interested in learning more, we have our Slavery in the President's Neighborhood Research Initiative at whitehousehistory.org. And I encourage you to check it out to learn more about the stories of these individuals and their lives in the President's neighborhood and beyond.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for your fantastic presentation. I learned so much. I think all of our viewers learned so much. You do such a terrific job for the White House Historical Association, and you did tonight for Flair, which we appreciate so much. I want to thank Stuart as well, who opened up our session tonight and talked about the work of the White House Historical Association and the Slavery in the President's Neighborhood initiative. So Historical Association has been a great partner with Flair since our founding 2 years ago. So we're grateful for that. We have a few questions, and I'd like to start with this one. But Abigail Adams, and as you've described her, she was an abolitionist and did not support the use of slaves, although she witnessed it. But what was, Martha Washington, her predecessor, they had a close relationship, but was it affected at all by that one had enslaved servants and the other thought that slavery was completely an antithesis to the principles of our founding?
That is a great question, Anita, and thank you again, everybody, for having me tonight. I think one of the interesting dynamics that we see in this founding period is that it's not unusual to see friendships and close ties between abolitionists or people with an abolitionist bent and slave owners. And I think the Washingtons are really an apt example of this because George Washington, of course, also being a slave owner, had close relationships with Lafayette, for example, who constantly talked to him about the issue of slavery and tried to push him in some way or the other. So when we look at these relationships, it's clear that there are conversations happening about the morality of slavery and behind closed doors that these women and men are considering and weighing the benefits and the pros and cons of slavery. But there's a different case that we see with Martha Washington in that she never seemed to take the stance that her husband did in the idea of gradual abolition, or the idea that slavery was morally wrong, but that we needed to find a way to fix this problem. George Washington felt this way, and he evolved a lot on the issue thanks to conversations with people like Lafayette. But Martha Washington, in looking in her writings, was very racially motivated in her use of slavery and genuinely did not believe that there could be equality between Black Americans and white Americans. So even if these conversations are happening with friends that are abolitionists like Abigail Adams, Martha Washington is not being pushed in the way that other people like her husband are.
And actually, that brings up a point that's a little bit similar to the Dolly Madison story that you told, which is really very difficult to listen to. About separating Suki from her daughter as punishment. And there is a somewhat similar situation with Martha Washington, right? And her slave, Ona Judge. Can you just briefly touch on that?
Yeah, so in the Washington household in Philadelphia, Martha Washington's lady's maid, Ona Judge, self-emancipates when she's in Philadelphia, seeks her freedom. And similarly, in this case, the Washingtons are very angry about Ona running away. George Washington, even in a sort of surprising and difficult way to watch, he demands the return of Ona Judge. He places many advertisements in the newspapers trying to find her. It's very clear that, like the Madisons, the Washingtons are shocked that somebody would seek freedom from their households, and they try to retaliate. But luckily, in this case, Ona Judge finds her freedom. She lives as a free woman for the rest of her life and does not have to fear the retaliation of other people in the Washington household that we see with Sookie and Ellen. But we do see so many of these parallels in the stories of First Ladies and their households throughout history.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. Here I have another question. What effect do you think having enslaved workers had on how a first lady handled her role? And how did she use enslaved servants to help her in her White House role?
Yeah, great question. The impact that enslaved workers have on the role of the First Lady in these slave owning households is immeasurable. Not only are they making the entertaining aspect of the White House possible, so providing the free labor that's necessary for dinners and balls and parties of that nature, but also having enslaved laborers frees up this time that a First Lady might need to spend on cooking or cleaning or taking care of children, then allowing them to instead pursue other things like entertaining, going out into the city, mingling with others. So we know in the case of the Andrew Jackson White House, for example, that Sarah York Jackson, his hostess, had an enslaved woman named Gracie Bradley, more like an enslaved child, who helped to take care of her children, allowing her to free up her calendar for social events that would otherwise need to be spent taking care of her kids. So it's in these different ways that enslaved labor allows First Ladies to pursue other tasks, but also be successful as hostesses.
And speaking of that, on the hostessing part, the social side of the White House, in addition to the First Ladies' maids that help them prepare and get ready, even dress for a party, were they also employed or used as part of the social entertaining of the White House, or was that left to butlers?
That's a great question. And, sometimes it depends on the household and the person that we're looking at. But for the most part, ladies' maids and on the side of the president, a valet fills many of these similar roles. They're typically in the behind the scenes area of a lot of this entertainment, whereas enslaved butlers or footmen would be more visible. Now, it depends on the presidency because there are some presidents and first ladies who try to make their connection to slavery a little bit less visible, or who realize as the Civil War begins looming that it's in their best interest not to show that they're relying so much on enslaved labor. The Polks are a good example of this. But it depends. And so sometimes you see households like Dolly Madison's where enslaved laborers are more visible, and sometimes you have ones where they're a little bit kept behind the scenes.
So one last question, if you don't
No
mind.
problem.
And some of your presentation, and you showed slides of actual slaves and their first name, or their full name, for example, Elias Polk, and I noticed a few others. So were they given the last names of their slaveholder? And that's first part of my question. And secondly, how difficult did that make it for you at the White House Historical Association to do the research into the slaves and their family members if family members were separated and were with someone else?
That's a great question. And it's one of the difficulties of doing this research is that, so it depends on the person. Sometimes an enslaved person gets to choose their last name after emancipation. That's why we sometimes will see the name Freedman be very common. It's a name that a lot of enslaved people chose for themselves to show their status that they were very proud of. But sometimes we see them choose to take the name of their owner simply because it's what's easiest for them. It's the connection that they already have. They may have already been called by that name in some capacity. So it's sort of on a case-by-case basis. But it does make it difficult when we're doing research to differentiate between people. And once we start to see some of these very common names like Freedman or others, then it can be difficult to trace them in ancestry documents because of the repetitive nature of the name. But it is helpful to have a last name. One of the things that we've run into in our research on those who are involved in the construction of the White House is that sometimes we only have a first name to go off of, and that is exponentially more difficult in trying to trace their lives. So it is nice in these cases where we do have a full name to do some of that research, but it's definitely a case by case basis on the nomenclature.
Well, we're very grateful for the work that you are doing at the Historical Association, painstaking research. I know you're adding information all the time and also helping to tell the story right there at Decatur House. So it's an extraordinary effort, inspired by the words of a first lady, as Stuart mentioned in his introduction with Mrs. Obama, and really an important, although albeit very difficult story. But we appreciate
Absolutely.
how you have enlightened all of us tonight. And thank you for your time as always and your good work at the Rubenstein Center.
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so very much. And so I'm going to close out our program now. And in addition to thanking our wonderful participant and our partner, the White House Historical Association, I also would like to mention, in addition to the Slavery in the President's Neighborhood initiative that you can find on whitehousehistory.org, we also want to reference one of our FLAIR members who's written an excellent book on this topic, Marie Jenkins Schwartz. Her enlightening book on the issue of First Ladies and Slavery is Ties That Bound, Founding First Ladies and Slaves. So this is additional information that our members and our viewers can get. What I would like to also say is to tell everyone, of course, about our future FLAIR programs that are coming up. As viewers will know, we have partnered this year with the Dole Institute at the University of Kansas for their presidential lecture series, for sessions that are being held in February and in March. The two in February have already taken place. The two upcoming in March, which are moderated by FLAIR board member and treasurer Diana Carlin, and that inclusive participants are all FLAIR members, experts with expertise in different areas of First Ladies. The two upcoming sessions, one on March 9th, First Ladies, Women's Rights and Suffrage, with FLAIR Vice President Nancy Keegan Smith and board member Stacy Cordery. And then at 7 p.m. on Thursday, March 23rd, First Ladies, the ERA and Beyond, with Myra Gutin, our FLAIR president, and Bob Bostic, the consultant to the Nixon Presidential Library Foundation. So please tune in. All of those programs are live streamed, and past programs could be found on the FLAIR website. FLAIR will be doing a March social hour, so please just watch for that on the webpage for specific date and details. And then in May, we will have a program on First Ladies and Preservation, and that is presented in conjunction with our newest institutional partner, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we look forward to that. And again, want to thank all of you for your support of FLAIR and for our work to promote the research and education of First Ladies. Good night, everyone. And thank you again, Sarah.
Thank you.